Piper ready?
I'm ready.
All right, great. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are fortunate and honored to have Rick Stambul, past president of the Buddhist Churches of America, to deliver our keynote address. His colleague, Mr. Piper Toyama, president of the Honpa Hongwanji Mission of Hawaii, past president, will introduce Rick and will also be facilitating the question and answer segment following Rick's talk. I'll add that Rick's talk is also being live streamed via YouTube to allow his message to reach a broader audience. At this time, I'd like to call on Piper to introduce Mr. Stambul.
Hi, I'm honored and glad to have this opportunity. You know, I've introduced speakers many times before in my past, and I found that often people tune out during the introduction, but this introduction is remarkable. So to encourage you to listen carefully, I will be giving a free trip to Vegas. The first person who identifies Rick's connection to Hawaii, his connection to President Obama, and where he lives.
Chicago.
Richard A. Stambul was born in New York City, grew up in Southern California and on his grandfather's chicken farm in the Catskills Mountains of New York. Rick served as a foot soldier in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He participated in a march in Washington and served in Mississippi as part of the Freedom Summer. During those years, he encountered civil rights icons, including Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Congressman John Lewis and Julian Bond, as well as Pete Seeger and other activists. He was active in the civil rights and the anti-war movements throughout the 1960s. Rick lived in Israel for a year in the 1960s and worked with Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. In August of 2014, he was recognized by President Barack Obama for his work in the civil rights movement. Rick graduated from UCLA, receiving a BA degree in history. He attended summer school at the University of Hawaii. He graduated from Loyola Law School at Los Angeles, earning a JD degree. In 1971, he co-wrote the first law review article published in the United States dealing with police brutality targeting the African-American community. He was admitted to the practice of law in California, New York, and Washington, D.C. He's appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court. Rick practiced law for more than 41 years and is now retired. He was a trial lawyer, and he also worked as a civil rights lawyer, providing pro bono legal representation. In the early 1980s, Rick interviewed scores of Japanese who were unconstitutionally imprisoned during World War II. Rick joined the West Los Angeles Buddhist Temple in 1985 and served as its legal advisor, as assistant editor to the West Los Angeles Temple Bulletin, and president of the temple in 2009 and 2010. He served as a member of the Institute of Buddhist Studies Board of Trustees from 2014 until today, and as president of the Buddhist Churches of America from 2018 to 2020. And that is when I got to know Rick very well. Rick became a grandpa in 2019 to grandson Jake. He lives in Sherman Oaks, California with his wife, Robin Steinhardt, their cat Sheba, and their friend Sam, a neighborhood squirrel of some renown. For those who do not know me, I was just joking about the Vegas trip. Rick, it's all yours.
Thank you, Piper. If you'd like, I'd appreciate it if some of you would join me in Gassho before we start, if you'd like. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda, Namanda, Namanda. I'd like to know from Piper if I can qualify for that Las Vegas offer that he has. I'm certainly sure that all of us will hold him to it. I'd like to wish my welcome and good morning to all of you today. I'm honored to have been invited to be your keynote speaker by Mr. Chris Richardson, President of the 58th Annual Convention of the Hawaii State Federation of Honpa Hongwanji Lay Associations. My thanks also to Reverend Eric Matsumoto, Bishop of the Honpa Hongwanji Mission of Hawaii, for facilitating the invitation process. I've been asked to talk with you today about Shin Buddhism and what it teaches us about anti-Asian racism and hate in 21st century America. My special thanks to Mr. Mike Munakio, President of the Wailuku Hongwanji Mission on Maui and Honpa Hongwanji board member, with whom I have spoken monthly at his request since last April to prepare for today. In addition to planning for this talk, Mike and I have gotten to know each other a bit by sharing our family histories with each other. So I feel as though in this process, I've made a new friend. My thanks also to the Maui District Lay Convention Planning Committee and to Mr. Danny Top and his tech team. I'm thankful to Piper Toyama, despite his offer of a free trip to Las Vegas. Piper, as all of you know better than I do, was head of school emeritus of the Pacific Buddhist Academy and past president of the Hawaii Kyodan. I thank him for his introduction, his help in preparing the PowerPoint slides for this talk, and most of all, for his encouragement and his friendship. I am deeply grateful to three of my Buddhist teachers, Reverend Dr. David Matsumoto, President of the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California, BCA Bishop Marvin Harada, and Reverend Greg Gibbs of Pasadena Buddhist Temple, who all have found me deserving of their time. I haven't done a PowerPoint presentation, I'm that old, so bear with me as I try to put this together on the screen. I think that's coming through. Okay. I'd like to talk with you this morning about a prayer offered by Shinran Shonin, the founder of Shin Buddhism, who offered us the following prayer: May there be peace in the world, and may the Buddha's teaching spread. It's this prayer I'd like to talk with you about today. Perhaps it can offer us some guidance, some new ways to look at racism and hatred, and new ideas about how to respond. My talk today is divided in 4 parts. First, our Shin Buddhist ministers and lay leaders, all of you, ought to help us make sense, I think, of the racism, the mass shootings, and other tragedies that occur so often in the United States. Second, I'll take a brief look at the roots of anti-Asian racism in today's America. Third, what does Shin Buddhism teach us about racism and about hatred? Finally, engagement. I will combine this Shin Buddhist approach with what I learned as a foot soldier in the civil rights movement and during my career as a lawyer, sometimes with a focus on issues of social justice. It's not my intention to convince you I am right, either about my views of Shin Buddhism or social justice. In fact, I think that Chris Richardson's comments earlier today during our service make that clear. Instead, I ask you to be courageous in your thinking, to dare to see a Shin Buddhist path that calls out to you to confront the racism and hate that threatens our families and can rob us of our own integrity if we remain silent. Part 1, Shin Buddhist ministers helping us make sense of racism in America. To be relevant in our lives and for our families, our Shin Buddhist ministers ought to help us make sense of the racism, the mass shootings, and other tragedies that occur so frequently. This is especially true when our Sunday Shin Buddhist services occur just a few days after some national catastrophe. When that occurs, it's the elephant in the room. It's on everyone's mind, and it can be deeply troubling. Some years ago, on the Sunday following December 14, 2012, the day 26 people were murdered at Sandy Hook Elementary School, including 20 children between the ages of 6 and 7. I attended services at 2 Buddhist temples of the Buddhist Churches of America. I had hoped to hear what Shin Buddhism teaches us to better understand this horrific tragedy that was on everyone's mind. Unfortunately, not one word was mentioned about Sandy Hook. It seemed as if the tragedy at Sandy Hook had been erased. That kind of silence is disturbing. Such silence is regrettably not uncommon in many Jodo Shinshu temples. I heard the same silence following the horrific murder of 6 Asian women in Georgia earlier this year. If the Dharma is to be meaningfully taught in America, it must speak to us. It must be dynamic. How can we make choices about our behavior in this world if our Buddhist lay leaders and ministers don't share or try to share what Shin Buddhism teaches us, how it informs us in times of national crisis about racism, hatred, and bigotry? The crises I'm talking about are the things we watch on the news, the events that impact our lives. Teaching Shin Buddhism must not be static. I think it must be alive and robust. In times of crisis, Americans crave reassurance as well as what their religion has to offer to better understand such tragedies. Otherwise, Shin Buddhism will fail to energize, let alone to be of much interest to our children and grandchildren. More than that, it will fail to give us the knowledge to make our own individual choices of how to act in this world and what kind of social action we wish to take. I challenge both our lay leaders as well as our Buddhist ministers to talk and teach how Shin Buddhism makes sense of the racism that confronts us in 21st century America. This is necessary if Shin is to remain relevant in our daily lives. Part 2, the roots of anti-Asian racism. Anti-Asian racism and hatred began the moment Japanese and Asians set foot in the United States. I believe that. Every generation of Asian Americans has been forced to confront and learn to live with the racism of their day. Such racism shapes our attitudes and the mindset of our children. It has been true for most every immigrant group in America. It's important, I think, to acknowledge the presence of anti-Asian hate in America because of its destructive effect, on all of us, regardless of whether we are ethnically Asian or not. Hate corrupts everything in its path and turns neighbor against neighbor. I won't discuss the history of anti-Asian and anti-Japanese racism in America, although that history is compelling, heartrending, and sadly instructive. All of us are outraged and saddened at the recent acts of anti-Asian hate and violence, the attacks on Buddhist temples, and the appalling murder of 6 Asian women in Atlanta. Regrettably, anti-Asian and anti-Japanese racism, hate, and bigotry are not new to America. Where does this hatred come from? Anti-Asian bigotry comes in large measure from a xenophobia deeply embedded in the American consciousness. The fear of strangers, of those different from ourselves, and the hatred and racism it breeds is complex and nuanced. Most experts agree it comes from the same notions of white supremacy that have most noticeably targeted African Americans. The idea that Blacks, Asians, Japanese, Jews, Hispanics, Irish, indigenous peoples, for example, are not as good as white Americans. It's even more insidious because no one really knows who those white Americans are supposed to be. It promotes the lies that Asian lives don't matter, that they are less than whites, less capable, that they threaten the lives of white people. These disgraceful narratives have been used to justify bullying, incarceration, violence, and murder. They provided the rationale to incarcerate Japanese, Japanese Americans, and Japanese Canadians during World War II. When I was an undergraduate, majoring in history at UCLA, my senior thesis involved an examination of public newspapers, magazines, and periodicals distributed in the late 1930s and on the West Coast and in Hawaii. I wanted to learn if there was a link between the news of the 1930s and the decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans in 1942. The Hearst news machine controlled and influenced the media, the major newspapers and magazines of that era. It was a powerful force in America. Together with a number of other organizations on the West Coast, Hearst news publications spread the narrative of white supremacy, that Japanese in America were anti-American, anti-democratic, and were not to be trusted. In short, the message was they were to be feared. Have you ever wondered how it was possible for the FBI to round up Japanese Buddhist leaders in Hawaii and on the West Coast so quickly after December 7, 1941? It's because the FBI started collecting those lists in 1938. The FBI and our government would have us believe that lists of Japanese community leaders and Buddhist ministers were collected in reaction to the attack on Pearl Harbor. That is a lie. The collection of those names was ordered because white Americans did not trust Japanese Americans. It feared them. As an attorney in the early 1980s, I took statements and depositions from scores of Japanese who were imprisoned during World War II. Many of them told me of magazine and newspaper stories that caused them humiliation and embarrassment, stories that promoted anti-Japanese sentiments and the false narrative of white supremacy. It all provided a justification for Executive Order 9066, issued on February 19, 1942, which led to the incarceration of about 120,000 Japanese in the United States. It's an uncomfortable fact that the residue of the incarceration of Japanese during World War II is still with us today. Just last month, Peter Yu, a United States Senate candidate in Colorado, who is Chinese American, commented that anti-Asian hate crimes are exaggerated. The Biden White House responded that Mr. Yu must have missed the news, because the PBS NewsHour reported last month that more than 9,000 anti-Asian incidents, both verbal and physical, have occurred since the pandemic began. 9,000. This racism is not confined to the mainland. Dr. Jonathan Okamura, professor emeritus at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, writes earlier this year that many Americans believe Hawaii is a, quote, veritable multicultural paradise permeated with the aloha spirit. Following the Black Lives Matter movement, this view gained even more supporters. A New York Times essay in 2019 entitled, quote, want to be less racist? Move to Hawaii. That further contributed to the misrepresentation of island society as a racial utopia. Continuing to quote Dr. Okamura, quote, such false depictions of the significance of race and racism in Hawaii obscure persisting problems, including the colonial subjugation and dispossession of Native Hawaiians in their homeland, the extremely dehumanizing racism against Micronesians, and the continued discrimination in employment and education of Filipino Americans, Samoans, and other ethnic minorities, close quote. Dr. Okamura adds that Hawaii, like the mainland, may not be racist, but its institutions are riddled with it. Maybe the place for some of you who wish to begin confronting systemic racism is right here in Hawaii. Every generation must confront the same struggles over again. The battles I fought and the blood I spilled in Mississippi in the 1960s to guarantee every American the right to vote are again being fought out in the streets and in state legislatures. Every American generation must understand that the battles against racism, xenophobia, and violence are never over. All it takes to ignite hatred that turns us against our friends and neighbors is a powerful voice. Part 3, what Shin Buddhism teaches us about anti-Asian racism and hate. And I promise this section will only be a few minutes long. The teachings of Shin Buddhism include taking social action to help improve the lives of others, of those suffering from racism and hate. What does Shin Buddhism teach us about the anti-Asian racism and hate we see in America today? Reverend Dr. Takamaro Shigaraki was a Buddhist priest and intellectual, universally recognized as one of the world's leading Shin Buddhist scholars. In his teachings about Amida Buddha's 48 vows, Dr. Shigaraki explains the first through the 11th vows, quote, set forth an aspiration that our human world needs to overcome discrimination and conflict to grow into the ideal world of harmony and equality we all want for our families and ourselves, close quote. Dr. Shigaraki writes, quote, a person who seeks an authentic understanding of Shinran's teachings of Shin Buddhism must do two things. First, we must try to determine how to act in today's world. And second, we must decide what the nature of our social action should be, close quote. These are questions we all need to ask ourselves. How are we going to act in this world? What should be the nature of our social action? To help us examine these questions, allow me to talk for just a moment about some core concepts in Shin Buddhism, the Pure Land and Shinjin. We've all heard of the Pure Land from a Shin Buddhist point of view. I've learned a compelling way to think about it. The Pure Land, from my Shin Buddhist teachers, gives a different view that I'd like to share with you because I find it inspiring. Dr. Shigaraki writes, quote, "The Pure Land is to be recognized as the ideal world which our own human society can become. Many people grasp the Pure Land abstractly, simply as a world that exists after death. Dr. Shigaraki says, however, that is not a correct understanding. Understood properly, he says, the Pure Land is the ultimate and ideal realm which today's human society should constantly aim to become. In that sense, I believe," Shigaraki writes, "that we should strive as one to make this planet reflect even just a little that Pure Land of the Buddha. This is what Shinran teaches us," Dr. Shigaraki comments, when he shares his wish, "May the world be at peace." We've all heard of Shinjin. How does it connect with our efforts to rid our world, our Pure Land, of racism and hate? My understanding is that Shinjin describes a real religious experience. It includes a sense of unrelenting self-scrutiny and a warning against self-righteousness that develops and matures over time. It awakens us to hear, to realize a radical transformation of our consciousness that allows us to aspire to peace, freedom, and equality in ourselves and in the world in which we live. The result of that transformation is that it can create a grateful awareness in our lives that allows us to engage authentically in compassionate work. Professor Shigaraki teaches that Shinjin in Shinran's teachings carries with it a reformative character and, quote, must involve confrontation and opposition to the norms of our society. In short, confrontation and opposition to our racist society. Thus, for Shinran, being a Shin Buddhist, living in Shinjin, includes someone who acts to help others. I suggest Shinran's wish, "May there be peace in the world," is a 21st century call to action. Our work as Shin Buddhist leaders lies in the answers, and the answers each of us makes to the questions, how will we act in today's world? And what will be the nature of our social action? I've tried to briefly share with you how I see Shin Buddhism in regard to the racism we find in the world today. When I was active in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, I'd never heard of Jodo Shinshu and knew very little about Buddhism. But today, and I've lived a long life, today, looking back on my life, I believe my awakening to Shin Buddhism has been there forever, guiding my life forward in a direction of which I am proud. And I am proud to be a Shin Buddhist. So what about action? Have some of our Shin Buddhist leaders had the courage to confront racism and hatred? I think every generation and every leader, minister, and lay is tested in this way. Reverend Emyo Imamura served as bishop of the Honpa Hongwanji mission of Hawaii from 1900 to 1932 and has been described as a towering figure in the history of Buddhism in Hawaii. Bishop Imamura, at great risk to himself, stood in solidarity with the sugar workers on Oahu. He struggled to help them earn a livable wage sufficient to provide basic necessities for their families. In the face of opposition to Buddhism from the primarily white and Christian community in Hawaii at that time, He published essays defending the compatibility of Buddhism with democracy and science. He advocated complete equality of all people. Similarly, Reverend Kenru Tsuji served the Buddhist Churches of America on the mainland as bishop for 13 years, from 1968 until 1981. Under Bishop Tsuji's leadership, he issued public statements on important women's issues, including abortion rights, written several years before Roe versus Wade. He publicly opposed prayer in public schools and objected to inaccurate portrayals of Buddhism. I challenge you as Shin Buddhist leaders to confront injustice. So how do we do that? Part 4, engagement and social action. When I was president-elect of the Buddhist Churches of America, I was invited to attend your Jisei Kai in Honolulu. It was an honor. When I addressed that gathering at a time when we endured almost daily withering attacks by Donald Trump, I quoted from Nelson Mandela, who was imprisoned for 27 years fighting to end racism and apartheid in South Africa. He said, "I have walked a long walk to freedom. It has been a long road, and it is not over yet. I know," he said, "that my country was not made to be a land of hatred. No one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin or their religion. People learn to hate. They can be taught, therefore, to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart." Shinran Shonin and many other Buddhist and secular leaders urge us to fight hatred with love. This is a beautiful sentiment. As someone who has lived Gandhi's theories and practice of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, I embrace this notion. Fight hate with love. How does nonviolence figure into this equation? Dr. Martin Luther King wrote countless articles about the use of nonviolence in the civil rights movement. He often said, first, nonviolence is not a passive movement. It does resist. Second, the point of nonviolence is to win over an enemy, not to humiliate them. Third, a person who wants to engage in nonviolent protest must try to embody agape, or unconditional love. Finally, the universe is on the side of justice. I find these to be both universal and Buddhist values and truths. So, okay, use love, not hate. Sounds good? How do we do that? I want to share with you now one way in which to engage violence and hatred with love, and how to do that. One of the talks I gave almost a year ago, which some of you may have attended, was about the history of white supremacy and the need to overcome our own prejudices. I spoke about several key events in the civil rights movement, including the March on Washington and the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama. These two instances remain the clearest historical examples I know to answer the question, how to fight racism with love. First, the March on Washington. Almost every one of us has heard about the March on Washington. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech is one of the great moments in civil rights history, in American history. John Lewis's speech that day is familiar to many of us. Both speeches reflect a country trying to come to grips with its racism. The March on Washington would be in the tradition and the spirit of a great prayer meeting to raise money and to raise consciousness. Civil rights activists from all over the country were poised to gather in front of the Lincoln Memorial as a call to America's conscience. It was a bold gamble, and it was a gamble. In the wee hours of Wednesday morning, August 28, 1963, I left New York City on a Greyhound bus bound for our nation's capital. As our bus approached Washington, I could see fires, a lot of fires in the distance. Everyone could see the fires surrounding the entire Capitol. At first, we didn't know what to expect. It was still dark, and the fires painted a frightening glow in the pre-dawn hours. We expected the worst. However, as our bus came closer, I realized dozens of people were holding highway flares that they had lit and signs reading, "We're with you and we shall overcome." These people had gotten up in the middle of the night to wish us well. That is when I first realized the March on Washington was going to be something unique, something different from the demonstrations in which I'd been involved previously. There were large identified groups of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews at the march. It was not a black march. It was what Dr. King referred to as a coalition of conscience when he spoke at UCLA 2 years later in 1965. The march itself was a blur of speeches, singing, mixed with a spirit of solidarity and common purpose. Singing folk songs about freedom and liberation with 250,000 others was one of the great highs I have ever experienced. We joined hands and lifted our voices to the sky. It was deeply connecting and uplifting. I marched slowly, step by step, from the Washington Monument along the reflecting pool, closer to the Lincoln Memorial. One of the forgotten speakers that day was, for me, one of the most riveting. Rabbi Dr. Joachim Prinz had the dubious honor of speaking immediately before Dr. King. Rabbi Prinz had devoted much of his life in the United States to the civil rights movement. He was a German-American rabbi who lived in Berlin under Hitler. He saw the plight of all minority groups in the context of his own experience under the Nazis. And so I'm going to stop my PowerPoint at this point so I can share something with you. Let me play, or ask Danny Top to play, the tech team in the background, a 2-minute video, 2 minutes, excerpt of Rabbi Prinz addressing the March on Washington. If you can, turn up your screen full screen.
When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life, and under those tragic circumstances, is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization, had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent, not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the dream, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself.
Let me put the PowerPoint back on. Bear with me here just a moment. So, what is the historical significance in the context of our talk of the March on Washington? I think Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary, who sang that day, said it best. Until that point, nobody had the idea ordinary people standing together in this kind of way could change history. That awareness fueled the creation of the women's movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. All the movements were born out of that awareness, that understanding, and awareness that we can do this. One lesson from the March on Washington is the understanding that the march itself became the example for all movements to come. A diverse gathering grounded in unanimity, informed by nonviolence, and focused on America's notions of democracy, equality, and justice. The March on Washington also offers us a different lesson, a sober one I think we all need to hear. As Rabbi Dr. Prinz taught us, hatred and bigotry are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent problem, the most challenging, and the most tragic is silence. Silence enables hate and allows racism to creep into our lives and the lives of those we love. By April of 1963, 4 months before the March on Washington, the civil rights movement itself was at its lowest ebb. The last major achievement of the movement had occurred 8 years earlier in 1955, with the nationwide protests following the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till and Rosa Parks' famous refusal to sit in the back of a segregated bus. It seemed the movement had reached its end. In May of 1963, the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama took place. The march is the story of how young people, many of high school and college age, faced fear, arrest, fire hoses, beatings, and police dogs, and brought segregation to its knees. It is living proof that teenagers, or those of any age, can change history. I'd like to share one other film clip with you of 13 minutes, which I edited from a film called Mighty Times, The Children's March. I'm sorry for its length, but this video will help you appreciate what took place in Birmingham far better than I could. As with the brutal murder of 3 friends who I served with during Freedom Summer Mickey Schwerner, Jimmy Chaney, and Andy Goodman that galvanized previously uninterested Americans in the civil rights movement. Only the advent of actual film footage and video brings home the message. I don't need to tell any of you that. This is even more evident today with the widespread use of social media, and most recently, the dreadful video of George Floyd's murder. So now I'm about to stop my PowerPoint and ask Danny to cue this 13-minute video. Please make your computer full screen if you can possibly, and hang in there for the entire 13 minutes. Thank you.
Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. It was the most racist, most segregated city in the South. On April 12, 1963, Martin Luther King left his room at the Gaston Motel and walked 2 blocks to the 16th Street Baptist Church, where a gathering of protesters joined him for a march on City Hall. He had targeted Birmingham as the site for mass demonstrations against segregation, but the masses had failed to materialize, and King decided to go to jail himself. The nation watched quietly as King was placed in solitary confinement. 1963 would mark Dr. King's lowest point as leader of the civil rights movement.
That was a beautiful concept after you think about it later. But when you get your head knocked on, you really got to think real hard and twice. Because the fellas down on 15th Street, those fellas would fight back. They came to fight. But because of Dr. King and them girls, they would say, y'all come on, cooperate. We need a peaceful protest.
On Saturday, April 20th, Dr. King bonded out of jail. His release caused barely a ripple.
We were defeated here in Birmingham. They had beaten us down into the ground.
Dr. King, in our strategy session, says that the only way to break Birmingham, we're going to have to fill the jails. So I said, I agree. I absolutely agree with you on that. Now, how I fill the jail is my business.
I remember that night, Dr. King speaking, he was trying like mad to get somebody to go to jail, and they just didn't stand.
I remember King inviting any volunteers to go to jail the next day, and nobody stood up but us kids.
That was it. Nobody volunteered but those kids.
Dr. King said no.
Good morning, children. This is Shelley the Playboy here on WENN.
D-Day was the day, I tell you. This was the day where every student in Birmingham knew that it was going to happen.
But you've got to remember that all of the planning was a secret.
Good. Googly woogly. Good morning, children.
The DJs would talk in code and use songs from the hit parade as signals for action.
I remember that morning I woke up with my mind on freedom.
Oh, I took special pain with putting a little starch in my blouse.
Had my toothbrush and I got the toothpaste, the soap.
Because I had a feeling that I wouldn't be coming home.
Ring, ring goes the
The disc jockeys pushed D-Day early in the morning, but they wouldn't even use D-Day. They was They use all that jive talk.
Don't forget, kids, there's gonna be a party in the park, and don't forget your toothbrushes, because luncheon will be served.
Back in the classroom, open your book. Now, everybody who's listening know what the deal is.
D-Day was the day. My mother said, okay, Gwen, don't go to that march. I mean, don't go. You go to school. The more we walked, the more we gathered, and every once in a while you look back and you saw it was more kids coming from somewhere, from another direction. You said, where are all these kids coming from?
You had never seen that many people in your life. It's like a football game.
Kids walked as far as 18 miles to get to Birmingham in order to be arrested. And the purpose was to go to jail.
The gathering place was 16th Street Baptist Church.
Oh, we poured into 16th Street like a waterfall.
They were coming in all doors, from all directions, from the basement, from the back.
It was just like one big pep rally. Here's Park, are you in the house? Or Western, are you in the house?
And who's out here from Western Life?
Children were ready. They were ready to hit the streets.
Kelly Ingram Park was the big green buffer between Black Birmingham and the white downtown. 16th Street Baptist Church was on one corner, and by noon, Birmingham's finest were on the other. It was all laid out like a battlefield.
To think about it now, I get the shakes. What could have happened?
Martin Luther King spent the day at his motel, wrestling with his conscience.
A lot of people thought the kids were going to get hurt. But the reality of it was that we were born black in Alabama, and we were going to get hurt if we didn't do something.
When noon came and went without a public appearance by King, Bevel opened the floodgates. They came out in waves of 50.
The first 50 came out, he peacefully arrested them, and that does it. And the next 50 shows up, then the next 50. And he go get some more paddy wagons.
They would cram the paddy wagons full of people, and then they would jam the doors shut.
Within an hour, the police had abandoned wagons and started to bring in school buses.
Fill up a bus, pull up another bus, fill it up. We arrested those kids in wholesale numbers.
Bevel timed it so that each group of 50 seemed like the last.
And what they didn't know was as the kids were going out of the front door, more kids were coming in the back door.
50. 50. So it's like, when they gonna stop?
I think when the police arrested us, they thought that we would be afraid and start to cry. They had strange looks to see that we were happy and singing and glad to be arrested.
Listen up, brothers and sisters. If today was D-Day, tomorrow will be double D-Day.
By day 2, the word was out, and more than 3,000 spectators converged on the church to watch. But no one could have imagined what they were about to see.
When we got to the park, police was lined up. They were marching, got ready.
got ready. Oh, good Lord, I scared to death. And then the officers gave the order to open up.
They aimed for your head to knock you down. And that water had pressure behind it. It hurt.
During the meeting the day before, they had told us the policeman might hit you, the policeman might have dogs, they might spit on you, they might kick you. But I remember thinking that no one said anything about water hoses.
You could see that the first blast of water dispersed the crowds. But when the water subsided, there were 10 kids still standing. And they were singing one word over and over.
The crowd surged back behind them. The firemen were suddenly faced with 200, then 500 protesters.
Bull Connor standing there with his hands on his hips. Shoot the water on those niggers.
The water was so powerful that 4 men couldn't hold it steady.
We could hear the firemen yelling, "Knock the niggers down."
The hose rolled me right down the street, like a sheet of paper.
And look, it would sting so bad.
Suddenly you could see against the sky these bricks and stones.
They were calling us SOBs and bastards, and it started with the rocks and the bottles.
They were arresting them as fast as they could.
Bull came through with that damn tank.
And black folk were throwing and hitting that tank with balls and rocks.
Bull Connor would tell them,
"Bring the dogs out."
Most of the dogs were on a leash, but if you reach out, the dog's gonna bite you.
There was this vicious, big old dog that turned it loose on just a smaller child, and the dog lunged at his throat, and it hit him and bit him.
Bull Connor was beat by the young people of the city of Birmingham.
But what really surprised us was when Kennedy came on television and addressed the nation and said, "This is the end of segregation."
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
I remember watching the president on TV, and I knew he was talking about me.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?
And once he made that statement, it's like tears start flowing. It's like, oh man, this guy gonna preach. And he went on and on and on.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise.
The Children's March broke the back of Birmingham. Birmingham led to the March on Washington. Birmingham changed the South in an incredible way.
Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there. I always find the success of the Children's March instructive and inspiring. So where do we go from here? Let me restart the PowerPoint. Bear with me. I've talked about the March on Washington because it teaches that silence in the face of hatred and bigotry is the real enemy. This is because not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. I shared the video with you about the Children's March because it sends a muscular message. Anyone of any age, from anywhere, can change history in the face of racism. My commitment as a Shin Buddhist includes my need to do something about the hateful racism we see today. I know what some of you are thinking. Nothing I do will help. Nothing I do will make any change. I can't make a difference. Why bother? I suspect this is true for many of you, particularly in Hawaii, feeling far removed from the mainland. Let me digress on that thought for just a moment. I've always had a profound emotional connection with Hawaii. Following my participation in Freedom Summer in Mississippi in the 1960s, inspired by my encounters with Dr. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and Julian Bond, being arrested, beaten, jailed, and hospitalized, my life was in chaos. I found a refuge for what I would now guess was PTSD, although that term was unknown back then. I came to Oahu. I lived in Honolulu at 2511 Kapiolani Boulevard with two friends. I attended summer school at the University of Hawaii. I worked as a short order cook at the Cam Highway Drive-In in Pearl City. I made the dashi for the Sai Min, which was popular. We almost sold out every night. Yet the manager stuck me out of sight in the back room, so his patrons had no idea a haole was the cook. Nevertheless, I made good friends and came to appreciate and love my Hawaiian ohana. And this has continued for me through today, after many dozens of visits. Hawaii has historically been diverse, and Asian Americans are a foundational part of the larger community. You may not experience the fear felt by your sisters and brothers on the West Coast or on the mainland. The violence and verbal attacks that create lasting emotional scars for Japanese and other Asian Americans may not be a part of your daily lives on Oahu, Kauai, Maui, or the Big Island. The important question that is always an issue for people living in Hawaii is how can we, living so far away, make a difference? There have always been Japanese Americans on the front lines of the civil rights movement. During Freedom Summer in Mississippi, there were two Japanese young men active in the movement together with all of us, Tamio Wakayama and Ed Nakawatase. Tam was a Nisei Japanese Canadian, born in 1941. At the beginning of World War II, he was rounded up with his family and 22,000 others in British Columbia and herded into cattle stalls. Actually, the Canadian-Japanese experience was even worse than it was for American Nikkei who were incarcerated. You may not know that after the war's end in 1945, Canadian Japanese could not return to their homes for 3 more years until 1948. These horrors are movingly documented in Joy Kaugawa's powerful novel, Obasan. Ed Nakawatase was born in California. His parents met in the Poston concentration camp during World War II. Like me, he was drawn to John Lewis and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC. I've heard from others that when Ed first arrived in Mississippi, he was asked if he was one of those humanitarians. He replied, "Nope, I'm a Sokuseki Buddhist." No one understood what that meant. He made it up. Sokuseki means instant in Japanese, and he told people he was an instant Buddhist. Wakayama and Nakawatasi wore ordinary bamboo just like me, but their presence made a difference, and so can you. What can we do to bring about constructive change and to honor the Shin Buddhist call I've talked about today, to help others by reaching out in the here and now, to stand up for our personal and religious beliefs, and to honor the memory of Dr. Shigaraki when he challenged each of us by asking, are we willing to make our own vow to take social action to help humanity? Will we embrace the Shin Buddhist vows in trying to end racism, hate, and violence? What good will come from nonviolent protest in Hawaii? Hawaii, in particular, with its diverse demographics and large Asian American community, should be the national leaders fighting anti-Asian prejudice and injustice. I believe that. The day after Trump was elected, there was a women's march across the nation. I've read the idea for this National Women's March came from a retired lawyer who lives on Maui, Teresa Shook. The Women's March was a national success, and the march in Hawaii was carried by news media across the United States. Nonviolent demonstrations of conscience about racism, hate, and violence do make a difference in the minds of others, and equally significant, maybe even more significant, a change in our own mindset, our own feelings about ourselves, about our own integrity and connection. People marching in front of the state capitol building in Honolulu, in Kaualui on Maui, next to the Lahui airport on Kauai, or anywhere, perhaps carrying banners identifying the marchers as the Honpa Hongwanji mission of Hawaii, would likely make national headlines. The paddle out demonstration in the ocean off Maui, honoring George Floyd, made the national PBS NewsHour. Bishop Imamura made a difference in the lives of sugar workers on Oahu. BCA Bishop Tsuji made a difference in the battle for women's rights. And they both made a difference in the hearts of Shin Buddhists. I urge you to consider forming what Dr. King called a coalition of conscience. Gather together, meet with Christians, Jews, Catholics, Muslims, other religious groups interested in equality and democracy. I believe they will be interested. Organize with other groups, women's groups, LGBTQ groups, young people, students, anyone interested in equality and justice. When racist acts make the news anywhere in America, be ready to march in the streets carrying banners of solidarity and identifying yourselves. Each of you can make a difference to help people, as Shin Buddhism urges, as well as for your own dignity and self-worth. When your grandchildren ask one day what you did in the face of injustice and hate, you might tell them you marched in the streets to help people. You might also consider combining that coalition of conscience with a committee of correspondence, to borrow that name from 18th century American history. Join together with the same religious and secular groups with which you engage in forming the coalition of conscience. Form an action committee with those who like to write. Be ready to write timely press releases and submit them to news media across America. If the publishers understand where you come from, for example, a committee of correspondence composed of a coalition of Buddhists, Jews, and other groups, some of them will publish your comments. Form a speakers bureau to invite people to speak to your temples. For example, Dr. Jonathan Okamura, the UH Professor Emeritus I quoted from earlier, might be a good choice to ignite interest. PBS has some compelling documentaries and interviews about anti-Asian and anti-Japanese racism. Show them to your groups to energize every member. If none of these suggestions appeals to you, write to the White House, to your senators, members of Congress. Do something. After my talk in 2019 about America and racism, I received a number of emails and even a handwritten letter. One young man in his 20s told me dismissively, "You're just an optimist." I don't consider myself an optimist. Instead, I see myself as a realist. We have great days ahead of us in this movement to fight hate. We can end the systemic racism in our police and in our country. We need to have a long view towards the future, because if we expect real progress in months or even a few years, then we're going to be disappointed. In 1971, my first criminal trial in Los Angeles, representing a Black man charged with assaulting a police officer, I sat second chair, working next to an experienced trial lawyer. Although the defendant did not commit the crime, several disinterested witnesses testified he was miles away at the time of the alleged assault. The police testified to the contrary. They lied. After the trial for which the defendant was convicted, I took the jury out to lunch to learn from them. I always did this during most of my career. Not one juror could bring themselves to believe, to even consider the possibility a policeman would lie under oath. It was unthinkable. Yet earlier this year, I watched the Minneapolis chief of police testify in the George Floyd murder trial about the illegal, cruel, and inhuman behavior of Derek Chauvin, a fellow policeman, now a convicted killer. This is a really big deal. This never happened before in the history of American jurisprudence, not ever. So over the long haul, I see the progress we have made and which we will continue to make. More than that, I challenge you as Shin Buddhist leaders, as human beings, to take a stand against the hatred and the racism that threatens our democracy, our children, and our families. What we decide to do in answer to these concerns may determine our future and our children's future. Let me end my talk today repeating Shinran's aspiration. May there be peace in the world, and may the Buddha's teaching spread. Thank you. I've lost sound.
Thank you, Rick. You've shaken me. And I think you did so with the others who are listening today. Thank you. Thank you very much. At this time, we have a few minutes for questions. And I'd like to start it off with questions that were given to me. Rick, you're challenging us as Shin Buddhist leaders to take a stand against hatred and racism. You outline actions that we may take. Here are a series of questions that might help us think about where we go from here. My first question is, do you see the actions you propose as efforts of individual temple members simply acting as citizens in small private groups? Or do you see these actions as part of organized Hongwanji temple efforts, or even district or statewide efforts?
Thank you, Piper. Your tough questions shake me. But seriously, though, I don't think your question goes far enough. Why stop at the efforts of just a few people or at the district or statewide effects. I think we need to think in terms of national efforts. It's always going to depend on the issues that are involved and how much each of us cares about them. Remember Dr. Shigaraki's comments I offered today. First, we got to decide how to be in this world, warts and all, just as it is. And then examine what Shin Buddhism has to say about an issue. And then, most important, what kind of social action we wish to take. There are likely issues I'm not even thinking about today that each of you can develop on your own, but issues like women's rights, the attacks on a woman's right to abortion, attacks on democracy, think about January 6th, ensuring the right to vote is protected and access is easily available to even the poorest among us. When George Floyd was brutally executed on the ground by a police officer, some people gathered together and held a paddle out in the ocean off Maui to honor him. That garnered national attention. First, we need to sit down and talk with our friends. We need to figure out if our temple is even interested, to find common ground, whether we can gather together with a few friends or an entire temple. Whether that temple or those friends are so outraged or affected by an issue, I think will drive the kind of social action that may be appropriate. Now, thank you for that question.
Yeah, I've been told that time is coming to an end, so I'll just ask one more question, and then I think we're going to have to end this at 10:30. And this is very specific. So, how do you see the development and organizing of like-minded lay members taking place? Do you have recommendations as to next steps for those individuals who embrace your call to action?
Well, there may be very few that are interested in embracing my recommendations for action, but gather just a few people together. Go out and have a cup of coffee to start, or all of those that may be interested, and learn what kind of issues concern each person. I think we need to reach out to other religious and secular groups and ask them the same questions. How do we do this? What do we do? How do we form an extended, what I call the coalition of conscience? Maybe the first goal of the group is to discuss and to learn an issue. Discuss the question you just asked me, and let the group itself kind of develop organically. If it becomes interested in social action, go for it. If it's not, then that's okay too. Teach all those interested about the issues. Back in the 60s and 70s, we called those things a teach-in. Form a social action committee. And if no one else in your temple is interested, move ahead with those who are determined to take a stand. Decide on a cause of interest that excites everyone, and then approach other religious groups, students, professors, anyone, to move together as one. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Our time has come to an end, and I would just like to say this. Thank you very much. You've laid out marching orders that children of the 60s understand clearly. I hope that the Gen Xers and the millennials will understand your call to action and pick up on them. You are leaving us with a path. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Piper. And thank you everyone for participating. I have to add that attending your service this morning and listening to Bishop Matsumoto and to Warren and to Chris Richardson's eloquent comments, what an impressive and difficult act to follow. Anyway, thank you very much for your invitation and for inviting me today. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess yeah, we go.
Oh, No, please, Piper, finish. Can we have Piper had a statement?
I was just saying, I was going to turn it over to you.
Oh, that's all it was. Okay, thank you very much. That was extremely compelling, thoroughly interesting and detailed and first class all around. So thank you both. We appreciate it, Mr. Stambul and Piper. We are going to take a short break and then reconvene at 10:40. And the next thing would be the meet and greet breakout session, 10:40 to 11:10. So the instructions for this breakout room are on page 3. You're going to click on that little breakout room icon and select a room. There's 3 rooms, and then we'll have 10:40 to 11:10. We're breaking to 10:40. That's 8 minutes. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy your break.